Check, check, check.
Well, just tell me a story. Listen to that.
As a black man, like I always approach like MLK Day and like Black History Month with this like almost a little bit of tension. You know what I mean? Like excited for the idea that we had, such a prominent figure in our community and our lineage that has done an incredible a lot for black people, the black church, America, and the world. You know what I mean? And that list could probably go on. But then also, I feel like the more time that separates, that like gets packed in between his death, and now, I feel like more of that like story gets blurred and gets reshaped and retold and repackaged in a way to help fit whatever agenda or narrative that the powers that be are trying to push or whatever. Does that make sense? And so, one, I want to ask you to kind of open up, like, as you approach like these holidays, that sort of like, especially specifically regarding MLK, like, do you have that tension? Like, what is, as a black man, what is sort of like happening inside of you as this time approaches with MLK and Black History Month?
Yeah, I think that's spot on explanation on the beginning of this conversation. I have similar feelings when I approach MLK Day, when I approach Black History Month. And the primary reason that I feel like that is because both of those events, MLK Day and Black History Month, are days that have come into existence, celebrations, observances that have come into existence reluctantly. And so MLK Day was something that was fought against for 2 decades.
Wow.
After his death.
Yeah.
And so and it was rejected by conservatives and liberals.
Both sides.
And both sides.
Yeah.
And even the filibuster, there was a 16-hour filibuster before it got passed by a liberal who didn't want to have Martin Luther King Jr. Day because, he was seen as a communist.
Wow.
Or socialist, right?
Yeah.
And so we shouldn't be celebrating that. And so there's a lot of revisionist history. There's a lot of whitewashing of King. There's a lot of whitewashing of Black History Month, watering those things down.
Yeah.
Right? Until we make somebody palatable. We kind of make them a mascot.
Yeah.
For the uses of whatever we want to promote.
Yeah.
And so that has been what we've made the holiday by and large. And so, we have the history, we have the tendency to do that historically. We do that with things that if we were to talk about these people in their totality, right, they provide a lot of uncomfortableness for us, right? If you talk about Christians in America, right, like if you actually read what Jesus actually says in the Bible, right, it's not something that I don't think that's what you believe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you get the further you the further away you get from that person historically, the more you can manipulate their words.
Yeah.
Right. And proof text their quotes. Cherry pick things that they've said.
Yeah.
Out of context.
Yeah.
To prop up whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
And so that's what we've done with King, right? We have made him a caricature of our own making and desires to leverage him for in whatever way we want.
Mm.
And I don't think that's just a white people thing. That's a general thing,
Yeah.
right? Because he challenges some status quo things that we don't want to have to think about because we want to be able to move into the world the way that we want to without having to face those challenging ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but there's also the struggle of seeing a person who has a long story. Like King is not just a static person in his life and his work.
What do you mean by that?
And so King, as any of us do, evolves as a person.
Yeah.
He matures.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times we miss how young King is.
Yeah.
And so King graduates from high school at 16, 15,
Yeah.
graduates from college at 19. By the time he's 25, he has a PhD,
Yeah.
right? And he has just become a pastor of a Baptist church. And he is being voted to become the face of a boycott,
Yeah.
right? The Montgomery bus boycott at 25 years old,
Which is crazy.
right? We don't think about that.
Yeah.
And he dies at 38. And so for between 25 years old and 38, that is King's life. We don't think about that. We talk about him like he was this 40, 50-year-old man, but
Yeah.
he was 25 to 38 is the window that we really get to see his work. And so if we talk about I'm almost 35.
Yeah.
And if I were to even think about the last 10 years of my own life and how
Yeah.
much I've grown and changed and
Yeah.
how I think about the world, how I approach things, like there's been a lot of change.
Yeah.
Like I look at memories on social media, you know, on Facebook, they'll tell you things that you said,
Yeah.
you know, a
it'll pop
decade
up.
ago, and I cringe at some of the things that I've said in the past, you know, compared to the way that I think about things now.
Yeah.
And so King is the same way. Like King had a view, and that view changes.
Well, I mean, let's talk about that a little bit because I think you bring up an interesting dynamic and the idea of like thoughts being subject to change and like new knowledge. And then I think this also correlates to what you said about like this attempt to sort of make King more palatable, you know, and I'm curious, back then, why was he not so palatable? Even though we look back and look back now and go, oh man, he said this, he did this was great, all this stuff. But like back then, what was so, I guess, like anti, like, you know, what was so like hard for us to like understand and like and sort of grasp about King? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the same thing that is difficult about King now is that you think that you can grab him and put him in a box, but he's evolving because he's an intellectual, he's a thinker, right? And he's open to criticism, and so he evolves as a person. And so when the Montgomery bus boycott,
Yeah.
right, is, you know, about equal standing in transportation, right? Black people want to be able to get on the buses and sit where they want to sit, not be relegated to the backs of the bus,
Right.
right? We pay taxes for public transportation, right? We pay to ride public transportation. We should have equal access to seating. And so that is the genesis issue of the modern civil rights movement, right? It's not the thing that actually makes people want to start, but it is the first primary fight. And so, but that is an issue of integration. And so the beginning of King's work is seeing him as this kind of integrationist, right? That all he really wants to fight for is unity and togetherness and, right, love in this very generic sense. And people think about his work holistically as that when that's never been true. right? But there's been, and I think there was this thinking, right? And King corrects this later in his life that the beginning to equality of liberation is access, equal access to voting, equal access to be able to, for education, for living, for all those kinds of things. And so complete integration is the access. And so if we get into the spaces where those things were in the marketplace, where things are happening, things are being sold, we will be able to participate in the marketplace in the way that we need to, right? But King eventually comes to the understanding, right, around 63, 64, that will not solve the problem, because you can be around white people, right, and still be excluded from the institutions that they lead and operate. And so he realizes, and this is through conversations with people like Malcolm X. This is through conversations with people like Stokely Carmichael and James Baldwin and others who are his contemporaries, who at points provide criticism of his approach, that economic liberation is the real end, right? Because it is those who have power, who have economic power and leverage, that actually are able to really create the change for their communities. And so when King begins to shift, right, before in his ministry, in his work, his activism, when he was talking more about integration and rights, in a way of generally like access to things, right, he was a nuisance, right? He was a nuisance. He annoyed people, but he was not dangerous at that point. And so King becomes dangerous when he makes his shift to, and this is the last 4 years of his life, to where he is heavy on talking about economics and militarism, right? And he's fighting against those ideals, to saying, hey, we need reparations, we need equal economic access, we need the end of global militarism, right? He says this country, right, it will lose its soul if it continues on in this militarism that it has. And so, and he is a major, gives major critique to capitalism. And so in the harm that it has caused, and he talks about the fact that he says, we like to believe that, you know, capitalism was created in this vacuum built on the backs of Puritan like values of hard work and commitment. He says, when really capitalism was built on the back of black people, and it continues to thrive on the backs of poor people in our country now, black and white. And he says that framework in and of itself is defunct, right? And it is unjust in and of itself. It naturally marginalizes. It naturally oppresses people. And that's what it's created to do.
And that's what I'm like. That's I think that's an interesting point, because I feel like, you know, and this is exactly what you were saying. Like this is the recipe to make, you know, King palatable, is like you reduce him to this section of his life where the emphasis was integration, was access, was, you know, all these things that were just a nuisance, you know what I mean? Versus the things that, would you say, like got him killed? And I kind of want to talk about like the perception around that, and like what is it, like how dangerous does the world think, you know, MLK is at that point in time? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And like talk a little bit about that, because we get this view now. We look back and go, oh, he wasn't a dangerous man. He was a man about love. He was a man about peace. He was a man about access. And like,
Mhm.
these are all, I mean, now, everybody quotes this as if, as if this was the extent of, as if that's what they actually mean when they quote that. So I'm curious, like this, it seems like we forget that like people didn't actually think that back then. People actually thought he was dangerous. People thought he was, et cetera. Go ahead. I'll let you tell it.
Yeah, and I think the difference here.
Hold the mic too.
Yeah, I think the difference here in what you're asking is what the implications of a particular pursuit are. If I'm pursuing integration, the reality is that black and white people have lived around each other in proximity to each other for a long time.
Yeah.
Right? There's the window of Jim Crow that has this explicit, right, segregation in it. Right? But the change never came from people being integrated together. Right? The problem that existed in slavery, the problem that exists in post-Reconstruction America, the problem that exists in Jim Crow, the problem that exists in modern times is economic power. This is why even right after slavery, right, there is the Civil Rights Act of 1865, which gives black people the access to be able to buy, sell, create, and enforce contracts and things like that. Because the general understanding, what goes without explaining, is that if black people are ever going to have real liberty and be able to stand on their own 2 feet, they have to be able to compete in the marketplace. And so they have to have economic freedom. They have to be able to create businesses. They have to be able to use the courts. They have to be able to do those things in order to really thrive and compete. Right? But then in the last word that I just said, compete becomes the problem. We can be in the same space. It doesn't mean that we're competing. Right? And so now when we get to a place to where we're talking about raising the economic and political power of black people to be able to compete with white elites in the big picture scheme of things, that is very dangerous. Because at the end of the day, the problem is power. Who has power? Who occupies the space? Who makes the decisions? Who has the leverage? And so people don't care. That's why it's easy for people to have conversations about reconciliation, right? Because that's just like, hey, we can live and be in the same neighborhoods. We can be friends.
Yeah.
But when you start talking about issues of power, right, people get really upset, right? Because that is what people really covet, right? Who has a seat at the table of decision making, right? And King realized that the philosophy was off.
Yeah.
And that's why he says things at the end of his life, like, I feel like I've integrated my people into a burning building, right? And what we actually need to do is be firefighters, right? And what he means by that is that I've spent a lot of my time as a black man in majority white spaces, right? And the burning building is racial hostility that exists when you occupy space, right? When you try to find out the economic secrets and loopholes and the way that white people live life and do things. Yeah. And I'm talking about particularly white people who have power, who have resources, who have influence, right? You know, you can be around white people and be closed off to those things. Yeah. And, you know, this is a conversation that I've had with white friends in the present. I was like, you can claim to be a friend of black people. I said, but are you a friend of black people the way that you're a friend to white people? Yeah. And what I mean by that is when you are with your white friends, like I've said at birthday parties and at different events that I've been invited to, and I just listen. And you listen to the conversations that people have about who owns what, right? Who controls what, who's sitting on what board, who's doing all these things. right? And you begin to see the type of networking that happens with white people amongst themselves, right? And then black people get invited into those spaces, and that same type of connection doesn't happen.
But not in those conversations.
Right? Because the reality is that I want to be able to say I'm a friend with you to alleviate my guilt, but I don't want you to legitimately be able to compete with me.
Yeah, the competition thing.
Right?
Yeah.
That's why, as much as
The Listening Lab is a space for honest and intimate conversations to better understand our neighbors and ourselves, and is made possible by the Walmart Foundation.